Hi sewing friends, it's Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my very favorite things to sew. That is knit fabric. I just love sewing all things knit, and if you follow me over on Life So Savory, you know that the majority of things that I do sew are made from knit fabric. So today I'm going to be talking about types of knit fabric and then how to get the best result when sewing it. So let's dive right in and take a look at some of my favorite types of knit fabric. All right, I've pulled a variety of knit fabrics off my shelves to show you some of the uses and different types of fabric that are available. The first thing I want to talk about is stretch. And when you're talking about knit, knowing the stretch is super important because that will determine what type of project you'll be able to make and what kind of fabric you need. So the first thing you want to do is determine if your fabric is two-way stretch, which means it stretches one direction, or four-way stretch, which means it stretches one direction up and down as well as side to side. So this has four-way stretch, which we would call it, meaning it can go up and down and side to side. This fabric here, another example, can stretch side to side a lot, but hardly any up and down. So we would call that a two-way stretch. All right, and I'll talk more about those types of fabrics here in a minute. So once you've determined your stretch, then you can choose the fabric for the project you're making. This is an athletic knit, meaning that it's used usually for sports bras and leggings, and it has really good four-way stretch. It's thick, not see-through, and there are a variety of different kinds of athletic knit, but I'm just going to generically lump all the athletic knit fabrics together for the sake of this video. All right, next is cotton Lycra. This is super common and used to be, I would think, the most used type of knit. It's been around for a long time, but there's a lot of synthetics now that are, in my opinion, much nicer to sew with. But let's take a look at this. So I already showed you that cotton Lycra can come in four-way stretch, like this one, or two-way stretch, like this one. And the one thing about cotton Lycra you have to be careful of is it often doesn't have a good stretch recovery. And what that means is once it's stretched out, it often stays stretched out. And so for clothing, this can give a really awkward look. And after a few washes, your clothing can be really distorted and not very wearable anymore. So this brown fabric is one that I used once, and its stretch recover is terrible. You can see here how it continues to be stretched out. So I will not be keeping this scrap of fabric. It is not usable because of its stretch recovery and its stretch. All right, so you want to make sure, again, when you're looking at fabric, that it has a good stretch that you need and has a good stretch recovery, meaning it bounces back after it's stretched. So cotton Lycra is a mix of cotton and Lycra, as the name would suggest, and is a medium weight knit, and it's used for all sorts of things. T-shirts, could be leggings, anything that you need a good four-way stretch for. All right, one of my favorites is double brushed poly, and this is a polyester synthetic fabric, as the poly in the name would lead you to suggest, but it's been brushed and treated so that it is so super soft. And it's one of my favorites for dresses and leggings, and it also has a really good four-way stretch. It's a medium to lightweight knit fabric, and again, usually is not super see-through, but you can see with the light that this one is a little bit. And it also has a really good stretch recovery, which makes it great for leggings and other things like that. All right, rib knit is totally making a comeback in knit fabric. It's a very thin knit with a good four-way stretch. It's great for t-shirts and dresses and comes in a lot of really cute patterns and designs right now. So I've been really enjoying sewing with rib knit, and you can see that it does have the little ribs on it in the design, but is very cute and a great soft knit to sew with. All right, t-shirt knit. This is your traditional thin, lightweight fabric that t-shirts from the store are made out of. And usually it has a two-way stretch, meaning it goes side to side across your body, but not up and down. And if you'll check out a t-shirt that is from any of your big name box stores, you'll see that this is generally the type of fabric that your t-shirts are made out of. A two-way stretch that's pretty thin. This one is really thin, but usually it's a thin to a lightweight to medium weight fabric that is great for t-shirts. All right, another fun fabric to sew with is sweater knit. And most sweater knits have two-way stretch, generally more side to side and just a little bit up and down. And they come in a variety of weaves, meaning that the stitches, some are tighter or looser. This is a pretty tight sweater weave, but generally there's a fuzzy side on one side and then a smoother side on the other. So sweater knits are really fun for creating fun tops. All right, another favorite of mine is Waffle Knit. And this is a little different than thermal. You can also buy thermal fabric for making long underwear style clothing. But this Waffle Knit is a bigger weave in the waffle weave and also has a good four-way stretch and is really fun for making tops and dresses that are very cozy. Waffle fabric also comes brushed or regular, and the brushed waffle is extremely soft and great for making tops. All right, the last one that I'm going to show you today is French terry, and French terry comes in a variety of weights. This is a medium weight French terry, and usually there is a smooth side and then a side with the loops on the back. French terry also comes in a brushed or regular version and is great for making sweatpants, leggings, thicker tops, sweatshirts. Any of those things are great with French terry. And usually it has a good four-way stretch, but often one direction is much stretchier than the other. All right, let's take a look at some of the tips we need to know when sewing this fabric to make sure that it keeps its stretch but doesn't get stretched out. Okay, first we're going to look at some of the stitches that are good for sewing knit fabric on your basic sewing machine. Even a basic brother model will come with some of these stitches that I'm going to show you. So let's talk about what you can use. So this little, we call it the lightning bolt, but this jaggedy edge stitch right here is also known as a knit stitch, and it goes back and forth on the fabric, which creates some give in the seam. So you're able to pull and stretch the seam without breaking it. You can also use a zigzag stitch, and usually I like to make it a little longer and a little narrower. And then it sort of replicates the lightning bolt, but not quite the same. And this also works great with stretch fabric. If you have a different machine with more stitch options, you can also use some of these other fancy stitches to top stitch your knit seams, and they will also create seams that will allow for stretch and give and be fine when you're sewing your knit fabric. But let's go back and demonstrate the lightning stitch and the zigzag stitch for sewing knit fabrics. Okay, so first we're going to try out the lightning stitch, and you also want to make sure that you're using the correct foot for the stitch you have selected. And on this one it says to use the standard J foot, so I have that included. And then you're going to take the fabric and place it under the presser foot. Now I want to simulate that we're sewing a seam, which would be 2 layers of fabric. So we're going to go ahead and fold this over and then lower the presser foot and sew this seam a little bit of the ways down. So this, you can see as this is sewing that it's actually going back and forth in a very, very narrow zigzag-like pattern. But this will give that seam some good stretch, and we'll be able to pull on it without the threads breaking. If you just use a straight stitch with knit fabric, you will find that the seams will pop and break as you stretch them over time. So you want to make sure you use one that is made for knit fabric. You can see here that I'm able to pull this seam and it has give, meaning it's not super tight. You can also see if we look up close that this has a slight zigzag feel to the seam. All right, so good. Stretch, check. Looks like it's holding in place. You also want to open up and check your seam and make sure you can't see the needles, because if this was a garment that you were wearing, you wouldn't want to be able to see the thread through the edge of your garment. Okay, so those are good things to look for when you're sewing with knit fabric. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is take a look at the zigzag, and I am going to make it a little more narrow, just so it doesn't take up as much space on our fabric. And again, we're going to fold it in half and sew down here and see if we can get a good stretchy seam. Okay, so I have a narrow zigzag going down and seeing if this will create a good seam for knit. Another thing you want to make sure when you're sewing knit fabric is that while you're sewing, you don't stretch it, because if you stretch and pull while you're sewing, you can stretch out your seams and they might never recover back to the shape that you want. So be careful not to stretch. Let the machine pull the fabric through and don't pull it from the back or push it from the front. All right, so here's our narrow zigzag seam used to sew knit fabric. You can see that it has a really good recovery. Personally, I would use this over the lightning stitch because I think it really does create a stretchier seam, and especially with the way my kids wear clothes, they are not gentle. So I like to use this if I'm not using my serger, which is what we'll talk about next. All right, so let's open up and check our seam. We want to make sure we can't really see the threads through there. Okay, and it actually looks really good. So not only do we have a stretchy stitch, but we also have a closed seam with no threads showing, and this should be durable for many, many wears if this were a shirt. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is sewing knit fabric with a serger, which is the ideal way to sew it, but I wanted to show you these two ways as well in case you don't have a serger sewing machine. Okay, so if you're using a serger to sew knits, it's actually made to sew knit fabric, and so you're just going to love the result. But it has 2 needles and 2 loopers. The loopers finish the edge of the fabric and the needles sew 2 lines down, and this combination results in a really stretchy, useful seam that's perfect for knit fabric. So also the thing about a serger is it trims off the excess seam allowance to give a nice finished edge when you are completed with the seam. So let's sew down here and see how this looks here sewing knit fabric with a serger. And with a serger, you usually just chain off an end and then cut it, so you don't cut the threads while it's still on the machine. All right, so here we have our serger seam. You can see it's a super stretchy seam. I love that. It's very durable, and you can also see how it's finished with the threads. And I have white thread on my looper, and then I have the blue thread on the back. You can also open it up and check that you don't really see those needle threads coming through, which means this is a great tight seam which will provide flexibility and wearability for whatever you are making. And there you have it, some of my super simple tips for sewing with knit fabric. If you haven't ventured into the world of knit, I hope this encouraged you to give it a try. Grab your sewing machine and a zigzag stitch, or your serger, which provides a naturally stretchy stitch, and some fun knit fabric, and get sewing.